There's a particular kind of frustration that builds slowly over years, sometimes over decades, in people who have done everything they were told to do with their money. They read the books, they followed the blogs, they listened to the podcasts, they opened the accounts. And yet, somewhere along the way, the gap between where they are and where they expected to be never seemed to close in the way the advice promised it would. This is not a story about laziness or poor discipline or bad luck, though those things exist and matter in their own right. This is a story about a system of financial guidance that was never fully designed around the people receiving it, and about the quiet structural reasons why conventional financial advice, despite its good intentions and occasional accuracy, so frequently fails the very people it claims to serve. To understand why this happens, it helps to step back and look at where modern financial advice actually comes from, because most people assume it emerged from some neutral academic tradition focused purely on helping ordinary households build wealth, and that assumption is almost entirely wrong. The financial advice industry, as most people experience it today, grew largely out of the investment and insurance sales industries of the mid-20th century, where the primary commercial incentive was not to maximize the financial outcomes of the client, but to maximize the volume of products sold to that client. The advice was real in the sense that it was not invented, but it was also shaped, filtered, and packaged around what the industry needed people to believe in order to keep purchasing financial products. And those two things are not always the same. What this produced over several decades was a cultural canon of financial guidance that sounds reasonable on the surface and contains genuine fragments of truth, but is assembled in a way that systematically underserves people at the lower and middle ends of the wealth spectrum, while disproportionately benefiting those who are already asset-rich. The instruction to max out your retirement contributions, for example, is genuinely sound advice for someone with a stable income, an emergency fund, no high-interest debt, and enough liquidity to absorb unexpected expenses without touching those invested funds. For someone without those preconditions, the same advice can create a situation where money is locked away in tax-advantaged accounts, while the person is simultaneously carrying 18% interest on a credit card balance, which is a mathematical negative that no market return is likely to overcome in the short or medium term. The advice is not wrong in the abstract, but it is being applied to a financial reality it was never designed to address. This gap between the conditions the advice assumes and the conditions most people actually live in is one of the most underappreciated sources of financial stagnation in modern households. Standard financial guidance operates on an implicit model of the financially stable middle-class household, with predictable income, manageable fixed expenses, employer benefits, and enough margin in the monthly budget to make incremental investment contributions meaningful over time. That model describes a shrinking portion of the population, and yet the advice built around it has not meaningfully evolved to reflect that reality. Instead, it tends to reframe the gap as a personal failure, a matter of discipline or prioritization, rather than acknowledging that the structural preconditions for the advice to work are themselves increasingly difficult to achieve. There's also a more subtle psychological dimension to how conventional financial advice fails people, and it has to do with the way it frames the relationship between behavior and outcome. Most financial guidance is built around a model of rational agency, the idea that if a person understands the correct behavior and chooses to perform it consistently, the expected financial outcome will follow in a reasonably predictable way. This framing feels empowering because it locates control with the individual, but it also places the entire burden of systemic outcomes on personal decisions, which means that when the outcomes do not materialize as promised, the only available explanation within that framework is personal failure. The person saved, but not enough. The person invested, but not early enough. The person budgeted, but not strictly enough. The advice itself is never interrogated because the advice is presented as a neutral transmission of financial truth, rather than as a product of specific historical, commercial, and ideological conditions. What behavioral economics has demonstrated repeatedly over the last several decades is that the rational agency model is a poor description of how human beings actually make financial decisions, even educated, motivated, financially literate human beings. People discount the future in ways that are predictable but not rational in the classical sense. People anchor to reference points that have no objective relevance to the decision at hand. People respond to framing effects that shift their choices without changing the underlying mathematics. People are more sensitive to losses than to equivalent gains in ways that consistently produce suboptimal long-term behavior. None of this is a character flaw. It is a description of how human cognition actually operates under conditions of uncertainty, complexity, and emotional salience, which is precisely the conditions under which financial decisions are made. Advice that ignores this architecture and simply instructs people to behave more rationally is not financial education. It is a request for people to override their own psychology without giving them any tools to do so. The compounding problem is that much of the financial advice most widely distributed through mainstream media, social platforms, and popular books is optimized not for accuracy or applicability, but for shareability and emotional resonance. Simple rules spread faster than nuanced frameworks. Confident assertions attract more attention than calibrated uncertainty. Stories of dramatic financial transformation generate more engagement than honest accounts of slow, uneven, statistically ordinary wealth accumulation. The result is a media environment saturated with financial content that feels motivating and credible, but is systematically biased toward the exceptional, the dramatic, and the simple, which makes ordinary people feel that their own financial progress is abnormally slow when it is, in fact, entirely typical. Understanding this does not mean abandoning financial education or concluding that all advice is equally useless. It means learning to ask different questions about the advice you encounter. Questions about what assumptions it makes about your starting conditions, what it is not telling you about the range of outcomes, who benefits from you believing it, and whether the framework it uses to explain financial behavior matches the way financial behavior actually works in human beings. The goal is not cynicism, but precision, the ability to extract what is genuinely useful from a body of guidance that contains real value alongside significant structural distortion, and to apply it to your actual financial life rather than to the idealized financial life the advice was written for.